Okay, so today we're going deep into Israeli politics
Yeah,
to explore the sixth Netanyahu cabinet,
right.
Israel's 37th government, and a topic that's really got people talking around the world.
It really has.
And
What makes this one stand out is that it's not a typical change in leadership. We're
right,
looking at Benjamin Netanyahu's sixth time as prime minister, and this time he's leading the most right-wing coalition in Israel's history, which is quite something.
it really is.
Yeah.
And we're using excerpts from the Wikipedia article on the 37th government of Israel
Yeah.
to kind of break down what this shift actually means for people,
Yeah.
from the controversial figures within the coalition to the policies being pushed through
Mm-hmm.
and the global reaction it sparks. So
Right.
whether you're someone who's getting ready for a debate or just can't resist a good political drama, this is one for the history books. And we're breaking it down for you right now.
The implications of this government's actions, they really reach far beyond Israel's borders, too. They're shaping the country's very identity both within Israel and on the world stage.
So imagine this, the year is 2022. The Knesset, that's Israel's parliament, has just finished up elections, and Netanyahu is back in the prime minister's seat. But this is where things get really interesting. He's put together a coalition of 7 parties, and some of these players are, well, let's just say they've raised a few eyebrows internationally.
To truly get the significance of these appointments, we have to look at the figures themselves. Take Itamar Ben-Gvir as an example. He was appointed Minister of National Security. This wasn't just a normal political appointment, it was a statement. Ben-Gvir's history of provocative statements and support for extremist views had many people worried, both inside and outside of Israel, about what it meant for the country's security policies and its approach to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
To put it mildly. And then there's Bezalel Smotrich. He became Minister of Finance, which is a position with a lot of sway over the economy and, very importantly, settlement policies. Smotrich is known for advocating for settlement expansion in the West Bank, which has consistently caused tension with the Palestinian population and drawn criticism from the international community.
These appointments, they weren't just symbolic. They showed a real change in the government's direction, one that immediately caused worry and, to be honest, alarm in a lot of places. It was a clear sign that this Netanyahu government was going to be different.
And those concerns weren't just about the people involved, were they? As soon as this coalition got into office, they started pushing through policy proposals that were met with, how should we say it, less than enthusiastic reception. We're talking nationwide protests, legal battles, the whole 9 yards.
Yeah.
It wasn't a smooth start for the sixth Netanyahu cabinet, and it really started a tumultuous time in Israeli politics.
You're absolutely right. The proposed judicial reforms, for example, weren't just met with polite disagreement, they sparked a huge wave of protest across Israel. These reforms, which lots of people saw as an attempt to reduce the power of the judiciary in favor of the government, started a countrywide discussion about the very essence of Israeli democracy and the balance of power.
It's like someone tried to rewrite the rules of the game and everyone had to pick a side. But before we get into the details of those policies and their impact, let's take a step back and get a closer look at some of the key people in this political situation.
Absolutely. At the center of it all is Netanyahu himself. A politician with years of experience now, back for another go. The way he formed this coalition, especially with controversial people in it, speaks volumes about his strategy and his willingness to consolidate power.
And then there's Aryeh Deri, leader of the Shands Party, a figure who really represents the complexities of this government. Appointed to multiple high-level positions only to be removed by the Supreme Court because of previous convictions. It was a legal battle that truly highlighted the tensions within the coalition and how the government approaches the rule of law.
What's interesting about Duri's situation is that it tells us a lot about the inner workings of this government. You have a coalition that includes parties with very religious ideologies alongside those with more secular goals. This natural tension played out very clearly in the legal challenges around Duri's appointments.
It's like mixing oil and water, except the stakes are infinitely higher. And if this complex political dance wasn't complicated enough, in October 2023, the Hamas-Israel war broke out, throwing another wrench into the works.
The war had huge implications for the already unstable political scene. We saw opposition leader Yair Lapid calling for an emergency government, a move that would have completely changed the balance of power.
And for a short while, it seemed like unity might actually happen, with the temporary addition of National Unity MKs, that's members of the Knesset, including Benny Gantz, into the cabinet. He was a glimmer of hope in the middle of the conflict.
A glimmer that sadly didn't last. The fundamental instability of this coalition reappeared when Gantz and National Unity left the government, highlighting how fragile that wartime alliance really was.
And remember, our on-again, off-again friends, the New Hope Party, they added their own drama to the mix by leaving the coalition for a bit, before eventually coming back. It was a stark reminder that in this world of politics, allegiances can change quickly, and even unity during wartime has its limits.
The war, in many ways, acted like a pressure cooker, making the existing divisions within the government even stronger. And revealing its weaknesses, it showed how much Netanyahu was juggling to keep this diverse and often disagreeing coalition together.
It's kind of amazing to think about how much impact this one government has had on Israel in such a short amount of time.
Yeah.
And like you said, the war really poured fuel on an already burning fire. But even before that, the sixth Netanyahu cabinet was making big moves with its policy agenda, an agenda that's caused debate not only within Israel but around the world.
You're right. This government hasn't been shy about going after its goals, especially when it comes to changing the judicial system. These reforms, as we talked about earlier, are at the center of one of the biggest arguments during Netanyahu's sixth term.
Right, the judicial reforms, this might sound a little boring, but this is a big deal when it comes to how this government is trying to use its power.
It's all about who really has the power in a democracy. Those who don't like these reforms say they threaten the core of Israel's system of checks and balances. For instance, one of the most controversial ideas would give the Knesset, which the ruling coalition controls the ability to overturn Supreme Court decisions with a simple majority vote.
So basically, the government could potentially pass laws, even if the Supreme Court says they're unconstitutional. That's a big deal. It's no surprise it caused such a strong reaction.
Exactly. This isn't just some abstract legal debate. This has real consequences for everything in Israeli society. For example, experts in economics have warned that weakening the Supreme Court's independence could hurt Israel's economy by making it less attractive to foreign investors who value predictable and reliable legal systems. They look at situations like Hungary, where similar changes to the judicial system led to less foreign investment, as a warning.
It shows how quickly political decisions can affect a country's economic well-being. And since we're talking about potentially huge consequences, let's talk about the government's stance on religion and state. They've made it quite clear they want to expand the influence of religion in public life, which is a move that's gotten mixed reactions, to say the least.
It's a tough balancing act in a country as diverse as Israel. This government hasn't hid its desire to increase the authority of rabbinical courts, which operate according to Jewish religious law, or halakha. While this might seem like a purely internal religious matter, it could actually impact a lot of areas like marriage, divorce, conversion, and burial, affecting not just the Orthodox Jewish community, but all Israelis.
And not always in a good way. We've seen groups like Mavoi Satum, which helps women navigate the often complicated process of getting a religious divorce, voice serious worries about how these changes could make things even harder for women in situations where they're already vulnerable.
Exactly. Mevoi Satum argues that giving rabbinical courts more power without fixing the existing biases in those courts could make it even tougher for women to get a get, a religious divorce document that's required under Israeli law to get remarried. And they're not alone. We've also seen pushback from LGBTQ+ advocacy groups who are worried that the government's focus on expanding the power of religious institutions, which often hold traditional views on social matters, could result in discrimination and hurt their rights.
It just goes to show that in a country dealing with such a mix of religious and secular identities, even what seem like small policy changes can have huge and often unexpected results. And we haven't even touched on the elephant in the room, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. With Smotrich leading the finance ministry and his past controversial statements about Palestinians, it's safe to say this issue has been a major focus for this government, both inside Israel and internationally.
For sure. The decision to put Smotrich, who strongly supports expanding settlements in the West Bank, in charge of such an important area was always going to be controversial. His appointment, along with his own provocative remarks, including one time where he completely denied that Palestinian people even exist, has made tensions much worse. These aren't just political arguments. They have real consequences for millions of Palestinians living under Israeli rule.
It's a powder keg, and Smotrich's words are like striking a match. And it's not just talk, it's the actions being taken. With Smotrich as finance minister, there's been a clear increase in funding for building settlements, a move that's been widely condemned around the world.
The international community sees these actions as breaking international law and a big obstacle to peace. Expanding settlements means Israel is more present in the West Bank, making it harder to imagine a future two-state solution. This has caused tension between Israel and some of its closest allies, who are very worried about what's happening.
And it's not just the Palestinians who are feeling the impact of this government's policies. The proposed changes to the law of return, which decides who's allowed to become an Israeli citizen, have sparked worry and debate in Jewish communities worldwide.
The law of return is a fundamental part of Israel's identity as a Jewish state, but it's also a complicated law that's been debated since it was created. The suggested changes, specifically targeting what's known as the grandchild clause, would significantly limit who can automatically become a citizen.
So for those listening who aren't experts on Israeli law, what does this grandchild clause actually mean? And why is it causing so much trouble?
In simple terms, the current law of return lets anyone with a Jewish grandparent move to Israel and become a citizen. It's based on the idea that Israel should be a safe place for Jewish people from everywhere, no matter where they were born or how they practice their Judaism. However, the proposed changes would mean that only those with a Jewish parent, or those who have officially converted to Judaism, would automatically be eligible for citizenship.
So let's say your father was Jewish and your mother wasn't. But you were raised Jewish and have always thought of yourself as Jewish. Under these new rules, you might not automatically qualify for Israeli citizenship.
That's right. That's why this issue has sparked so much discussion, especially among Jewish communities outside of Israel. Critics of these changes argued that they could create different levels of Jewishness, separating those who qualify for citizenship from those who don't, and potentially weakening the whole idea of a global Jewish community.
It's almost like trying to decide who's Jewish enough, which is a huge problem nobody really wants to deal with. And this isn't just theoretical. These changes could have real consequences for people's lives. Imagine you're a young Jewish person living in Argentina, and your grandfather could move to Israel, but your parent couldn't. Under these changes, your dream of making Aliyah, of moving to Israel, could become a lot harder.
Absolutely. It's easy to see why this issue has struck a nerve. It touches on deeply held beliefs about identity belonging and what it means to be Jewish in a globalized world. And the world is watching the sixth Netanyahu cabinet's handling of these important issues. From the judicial reforms to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and the law of return has attracted attention and concern from many of Israel's closest partners.
It seems like everything this government does has ripple effects that go far beyond Israel's borders. But it's not just their foreign policy, it's also how they're running things within Israel that's raising eyebrows.
What's particularly noticeable is how this government has tried to strengthen its control within the Israeli government itself. There's a concerning pattern of experienced civil servants in important positions being replaced with political appointees. These are often people closely connected to the ruling coalition, but who might not have the skills or knowledge to effectively run their ministries.
So it's less about having the best person for the job and more about having someone who will follow the party line. How is this impacting how the government works on a daily basis?
Well, we're starting to see the results. There have been reports of important government services slowing down, experienced civil servants quitting because they feel like their expertise doesn't matter, and a growing feeling of politicization within ministries that used to be fairly separate from political influence.
It's like switching out the experienced mechanics who keep the engine running for a team that's better at following orders than actually knowing how to fix anything.
That's a great comparison. Take, for example, the controversy with appointments at the National Library of Israel. The government replaced the library's board with people seen as more aligned with their views ideologically, leading to accusations of political meddling in a cultural institution.
Not a good look for a government that claims to be all about free speech and open discussion, right?
Exactly. And it's not just happening in cultural places. We've also seen attempts to weaken the Ministry of Environmental Protection, which critics say is more about political convenience than actually caring about the environment. The worry is that by filling these ministries with loyal followers, the government is putting short-term political gains ahead of the long-term health and well-being of both the environment and the institutions meant to protect it.
It's a classic example of short-sightedness, choosing quick political wins over long-term stability. And speaking of putting long-term stability at risk, we need to talk about a big issue in Israeli politics: corruption. It's a problem that's affected past governments. And sadly, the sixth Netanyahu cabinet hasn't avoided these concerns.
You're right. Even though they've tried to present themselves as different from the past, this government has faced its own accusations and scandals related to corruption. What's especially troubling is that some of these accusations go against the core principles of a democratic government.
Okay, let's get into the details here. When we talk about corruption, what are some examples that have raised red flags?
There have been a few things that have made people question the transparency and accountability of this government. One really worrying example is the attempt to reduce oversight of ministerial appointments. The government tried to pass a law that would significantly reduce the Attorney General's power to examine and potentially block ministerial appointments that seemed wrong or conflicted.
So basically trying to stop an independent watchdog from barking when it sees something suspicious.
You could say that this move was widely seen as a way to protect potentially problematic appointments from being examined and to give the prime minister's office more power. Thankfully, this particular bill faced a lot of public opposition and was eventually withdrawn. But it left people feeling uneasy about whether this government really wants to maintain those crucial checks and balances.
And that wasn't the only thing that raised eyebrows, was it?
Yeah.
There was also that whole issue with trying to change the rules about political donations, especially when it came to money for legal defense.
Oh, yeah. That was another situation that really made people question the government's ethics and accountability. They tried to pass a law that would let Netanyahu accept donations from individuals to pay for his legal expenses and the corruption investigations against him.
So essentially letting someone potentially make money from a situation while they're being investigated for financial wrongdoing. That's like letting the fox guard the henhouse while it's on trial for eating chickens.
It definitely didn't look good for the government. Critics said that if this law was passed, it would have created a clear conflict of interest and made people trust the political system less. Thankfully, like the attempt to weaken oversight over ministerial appointments, this proposal also faced a lot of opposition and was dropped in the end.
It's good to see that even with all the political tension, there's still lines the government won't cross, at least not without facing serious consequences. But it makes you wonder, where do we go from here? What's the plan for the sixth Netanyahu cabinet?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? We've gone deep into the complexities of this government, from its controversial members to its divisive policies and its questionable approach to governing. And what we found is a picture of a government that seems determined to change the very nature of Israeli society, even if it means changing or breaking some of the rules and traditions that have defined the country for decades.
It's like they're playing a high-stakes game of chess, willing to sacrifice pieces and even risk their queen to win. But we're still seeing how those big moves will play out.
Exactly. The sixth Netanyahu cabinet is definitely leaving its mark on Israel, but the long-term impact of its actions both within the country and internationally remains to be seen. One thing's for certain, this is a government that isn't scared to shake things up, for good or for bad.
Feels like we've really gone down the rabbit hole of this whole thing, huh?
It does, doesn't it?
This government really seems set on making its mark, for better or worse. But what does it all really add up to? We've talked about who's in the coalition, those policies that are causing such a stir, the concerns about how this government is doing things, even hints of corruption. It's a lot to process.
It is, and it all points to a crucial turning point for Israel. We're not just talking about one election or a few controversial laws. The things this government is doing and the way people are reacting to them are forcing a conversation about core values, identity, and the kind of future Israelis want for their country.
It's almost like Israel is at a crossroads, having to choose which way to go.
Exactly.
And the stakes are incredibly high.
They really are. Will the sixth Netanyahu cabinet soften its approach, maybe because of pressure from within Israel or from its allies around the world? Or will they stick to their plan, even if it means dividing Israeli society even more and hurting those important international relationships?
Because let's face it, you can't just overhaul the court system, redraw the lines on religious influence, and change the dynamics of a decades-long conflict without upsetting someone, right? We're witnessing a power struggle between those who think this government is what's needed, a chance to create a strong national identity, and those who are afraid it's tearing down the very things that made Israel's democracy, and it's standing in the world what it is.
And you can feel that tension in every single debate, every protest, every international news story about Israel. This isn't a story with a clear ending in sight. The sixth Netanyahu cabinet has set a course, but where it ultimately leads, well, that's what we'll all be watching to find out in the months and years ahead.
I think that's a good place to leave it for today. Thanks for diving into this complex and ever-evolving story with me.
Of course. It's been a pleasure, as always.
And to our listeners, thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Make sure to check back for more fascinating explorations of current events and global affairs. Until next time, keep asking those tough questions and stay informed.